answering the question asked in the panel. And the question today is, where is the global jihad headed? How is Al-Qaeda doing? And I want to invite each of our participants to give me a one-sentence response to that particular question. Where is the global jihad headed? Is global jihadism up or down? Where is it going? In one sentence, John, what would you say?
It's sentence. Done. It's for is but decline.
Pretty much what I was saying, what I said, much strategic that great damage has a great deal of resilience, so it will take a long time for this threat to decline.
I'd say, just in keeping with my talk, I'd say a lot of it does depend on how it goes for them in Africa. A lot of it does depend on the will of the African Union to prevent them from setting down roots. And if they manage to do what they want and establish themselves, we could see a big sort of a resurgence from the heart of Africa, I believe.
If you speak about the organization, I think it's down but not out. And if you speak about the global jihad in general, I think that there is a shift just away from Al-Qaeda Central towards the affiliates, and also towards what I call the inspired adherents of Al-Qaeda.
Don?
Thanks. So I think the real answer is we will see. I agree with your brief yesterday or 2 days ago on Al-Qaeda's in transition, the global jihad's in transition. So we don't really have an answer. I would just say that it's likely to be, the trend that we're seeing about it being more fractured movement and more distributed phenomenon, in my opinion.
Colonel?
I think that they are in a junction, in not a strategic but maybe operative junction. And as I see the things, they increase the risks, and I think that they will fit themselves to the reality quicker and better than the world. And unfortunately, I see it very badly to the next few years.
Okay. So pretty much everyone on the panel said Al-Qaeda is either, Al-Qaeda is at the crossroads, in a sense. It is down but not out, and we will have to wait and see where it is going. Pretty much everyone agrees it is a movement or an organization in transition. Is there anyone in the audience who believes that Al-Qaeda is finished, or anyone who believes that Al-Qaeda is actually resurging? Yes, please, sir. Resurging. And why would you say that? And who are you?
I'm James Brooks. I'm an analyst at NATO.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Sela asked the question, what would Al-Qaeda say? And I think this is what Al-Qaeda is going to say. First of all, the Arab Spring caused the removal of regimes in the areas which we wanted to increase our influence. Okay? Arab Spring was a positive thing. There's no two groups popping up at once.
maybe I can interrupt you just here, because that's already a lot of food for thought. And maybe you should do those tapes for it would be much more effective from their point of view.
Let me tell you,
Yeah.
I thought strategy from the standpoint. I look at Al-Qaeda's objective, see where they're going and why they're going to do it. And I think we focus too much on their weaknesses, not other weaknesses.
Okay. So, okay, let's bring you in. And could you please introduce yourself again? Okay. So we had a couple more. Sir, could you also please introduce yourself? Wonderful.
2001 was a very, I'd say, potent virus we discovered, which is called Al-Qaeda. The virulent virus that was developed as a result of the antidotes, properly, that were used against Al-Qaeda is a much more, today's virus, much more virulent. No doubt there was, the Arab Spring helping, but it's not just the Arab Spring, it's the global environment which then supports Al-Qaeda in places where there's either a regime that is not capable of handling it, or where there is an Arab regime, clerical, radical regime that doesn't want peace. And Al-Qaeda is much more adaptable than we think. You know, we had in mind in 9/11, now there's going to be a repeat performance of another mega terrorist attack like the Twin Towers, like the Twin landmines. No, I don't think so. I think that their main effort was on the consciousness of people, the cyber element. In other words, try to put Al-Qaeda, first of all, put the fear of Al-Qaeda into those that they attack, and get the kind of recruitment that they can get through the use of the, I would say, the Arab movement, radical Islamic Arab movement, and then spread out to those places where there's no opposition. So now we have a much more virulent virus and much more immune, and its immunity was based on the fact that we gained in the last 10 years a lot of experience in fighting those and how to deal with those. And they weren't staying on the same things. They constantly pivot to their tactics. They're constantly thinking about new methods, lots of thinking out of the box. And they don't need centralized control and centralized command and control, spread out. The regional is much more dangerous than the global war debate. So, and really, the only thing that seemed to work was the Israeli thing. You know, when they got Osama bin Laden, I was in Times Square, just happened to be in a reporter who knew me from before, stuck a microphone into me. What do you think about our president right now? I said, well, the first time that he acted like an Israeli. Target assassination, which seems to be like, but that's only a snap assassination. This is like, getting the flies rather than draining the swamp. The swamp is much bigger.
Okay. So we had you, sir.
Dr. Rassler, I would echo some of the comments. I think that, this debate over whether or not this Al-Qaeda is successful and this is going to be next. And, playing styles between you and Jihad, but I have some competitors that are looking at the trigger point on this debate that actually introduce the question of this, or actually is going to take place. And I heard you said Al-Qaeda is going to introduce
One sentence. One sentence.
We're only at the embryonic stage of trying to learn and understand the sophisticated response that the Iraq is providing.
Well, that's another topic, and I want to hand that and other things back to the panel. But given from what all these people have said, all of you have been too optimistic. So how would you answer those charges? Shiraz, what would you say in response to gentlemen here?
The honor of going first. Well, I think the first thing that struck me, with your comments when you started, was I think there's a conflating of too many things there insofar as the individual motivations of different groups and different fighters within those organizations needs to be boiled down much more. So in the context of Syria, for example, I think you have a lot of fighters now teaming up very pragmatically, for example, with jihadists. The jihadists are bringing an expertise that the FSA doesn't have. The FSA are a bunch of soldiers who have defected that don't necessarily have the guerrilla tactics or the networks to raise funds and so on in the way that the jihadists who waged a very long campaign in Iraq, for example, can do. So I think necessarily to say that this is all going in Zawahiri's favor in that sense, it requires us to probably boil it down a little bit further. And there's a lot of texts which talk about and divide jihadists maybe into three categories. In fact, there's a forthcoming book which uses these. I just scribbled them down, but the idea of the classical jihadist who looks to, as it were, the defense of Muslim lands in the classical Abdullah Azzam kind of way, fighting the Soviet Union in the 1980s. The Islamo-nationalists who are essentially committed to their country but want to inflect a more Islamist tone and character within it. And then, of course, the global jihadists who would attack the West and try to replicate attacks such as 9/11 and 7/7 and so on. So I think we are seeing this big proliferation of the kind that you described, taking each case on a case-by-case basis, taking them on their relative merits. I think there's still a lot for Zawahiri to be afraid of. And I think actually with the Arab Spring, the constitutional elements and the legalized elements now that we've seen of, as it were, political Islam, not jihadists, so the Brotherhood and Nahda, as I was touching upon in my presentation, has actually given a channel to a lot of these people to express their desires and wishes through a more legitimized framework. So in a way, you could argue this will actually, over time at least, undermine the methods and tactics that Zawahiri wants to take forward. So a short-term bounce, but a long-term loss.
Alex, maybe all of you, like a fairly quick response.
Sure. Well, I think we can even look at the Israeli example for guidance, because as you well know, as an advisor to Iran, the targeted killings were one of the primary reasons why the threat from Hamas reduced drastically. The tactic was, look, there's a lot of people who want to be part of Hamas, there's a lot of members of Hamas, but there's only a small group that can actually operate effectively, that can build the bombs, that have the technical expertise, that have the charisma, that have the leadership knowledge to make a group of angry young men into an actual effective terrorist organization. And we saw in Israel that the threat from Hamas is reduced hugely because of that. And so, if you get rid of guys like Awlaki, like Abu Yahya al-Libi, like Atiyah, well, then you've got a lot of people who want to do something, but how are they going to do it? Especially if you keep taking out the bomb makers. AQAP's, I've forgotten his name now, but the expert bomb maker for AQAP, they're heavily reliant on him. They have him wrapped in cotton wool. If we take him out, they're going to be in big trouble as far as being able to coordinate anything serious. So I think that reducing the leadership is going to make it very, very difficult for them to channel all of perhaps the desire that still exists to take out Al-Qaeda. Also, I think when you ask the question, how's Al-Qaeda doing, you've got to split it up into where are they and where are we talking about. If we're talking about in the West, well, Britain in particular, which I think the threat has reduced hugely over the last few years. At one point, when we still weren't taking it that seriously, there was a very strong connection between the Pakistani diaspora community in Britain and the area which they come from in Pakistan, many of which was Kashmir, Azad Kashmir. That meant that it was very easy for them to travel back and to go for a wedding, for example, and go get training with one of the Kashmiri jihadist groups and come back, just like we had in 2005 in 7/7, that's almost impossible to do now. You can't just go to Somalia or go to Pakistan and no one's going to notice. We are so on top of them now that the worst that's going to happen, I believe, in any time soon is like the Russian Nara Chowdhury case, the girl who tried to kill her local MP with a kitchen knife. I think that, like I said, the capabilities are so much reduced now that it's just going to be very difficult to go and learn how to make a really good bomb and come back and no one's going to know about it. Okay. But yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, Assaf.
Again, I think it's very important to first of all say what are we talking about? So if we're talking about, because there's an Al-Qaeda organization, of course, and then there's the global jihad, which consists of an organization but also of affiliates and also of inspired adherents. And when we're talking about Al-Qaeda, the organization, I think that it was thrown a lifeline by the Arab Spring just at the time when it most desperately needed one, when it was really weak. But then came the Arab Spring, and it presented new opportunities to Al-Qaeda, essentially, to survive. And especially, I think, the biggest opportunity is that the Arab Spring has started to create and will probably continue to create a number of failed states. And Al-Qaeda has always been fantastic at exploiting failed states for its own ends. And so that, I think, is the greatest hope for Al-Qaeda. I also said earlier that I think that in terms of the larger global jihad movement, there is a relative shift away from Al-Qaeda Central towards the affiliates, but also towards the inspired adherents. And that has very important implications, because we could see, for example, among the most potent attacks or attempts at attacking the West in the last few years, these were actually not Al-Qaeda Central attacks, but these were actually attacks by affiliates, right? If you look at the printer cartridges plot, if you look at the underpants bomber, right? If you look at the rectal cavity suicide attack against the Saudi deputy interior minister, I mean, these were all attacks that were conducted on the part of affiliates. And if you look at the inspired adherents, I mean, if you look at the Fort Hood shooting, for example, I mean, that is something that those types of attacks, I think we will see more of them. So I didn't mean to say that the threat has decreased. It has shifted.
Okay. Don. Briefly, please.
Sure. A lot of these different comments revolve around the Arab Spring, and while the Arab Spring might create some opportunities and currently are creating opportunities for various organizations to take advantage of, will there be space for Al-Qaeda inspired elements or Al-Qaeda itself to take advantage of the Arab Spring? Sure. Does it mean that the Arab Spring will entirely benefit Al-Qaeda? No. We've seen that the Arab Spring, in terms of places like Egypt, is a full rejection of the methods that Al-Qaeda inspired. Their method of violent jihad. And you have an entity like the Muslim Brotherhood being, elected in Egypt, and actually, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad group being a break-off from the Muslim Brotherhood. These sort of dynamics are hard for Al-Qaeda to reconcile. And I'm not saying that there won't be space, but to assume that the Arab Spring, whether in places like Syria or Libya or Egypt, will just fully benefit Al-Qaeda, I think at this point, while that could be the case, I think is an assumption. And I really do think it's too early for us to make that firm decision, because there's too many ambiguities, there's too many complexities. Added to this, I think a lot of the issues raised also sort of tie back to the question of, does Al-Qaeda's brand resonate? And for many people, or certain areas, maybe it's in Nigeria with Boko Haram, that might be the case. But I also think at this stage, it's too early to firmly answer that question, particularly when we probably don't know enough about entities like Boko Haram. And so our default explanation maybe is to put it into an Al-Qaeda box and explain it that way. I just think that ignores some of the complexity that's out there. And Al-Qaeda is in transition. You might well be right in terms of Al-Qaeda is growing. My opinion is it's just too early to sort of come down one way or the other.
Colonel, very briefly.
I try to describe you a small scenario. In one morning in the future, we will wake up and start to get by the new media details and information that in 150 countries simultaneously, 5 people wake up in the morning or at the evening, took a knife and stabbed 5 local people. Is it can be possible or not? I exaggerate, or this is a thing that we might ask ourselves how it didn't occur before, because it's so simple and it's so can be happen that it shows us that we think mainly about what was in the past, and we can't yet or don't want to estimate what simply might happen in the future. And because of that, I think that Al-Qaeda and the global jihad is a very, very dangerous enemy, and the bad is yet to come.
Very briefly, just to say, I think that's a brilliant description of what Zawahiri would say, but of course he would say that. So just a couple of observations. Al-Qaeda are a product of the old Middle East, and it's not quite clear how they can adjust themselves and fit into the changing Middle East, although I entirely agree there are opportunities for them to do so. Secondly, as much as a sort of counter-terrorism policy against Al-Qaeda has had effects, they've also made significant strategic errors of their own when handed opportunities, and the way they behaved in Iraq, for example, is something which did diminish their brand quite significantly. And third, a lot of the traits of Al-Qaeda which we interpret as strength or a capacity to metastasize or dynamism are actually symptoms of weakness. And a product of the fact that that certain avenues of conduct have been shut down for them increasingly, such as aviation plots, centrally organized plots. So of course they'll take advantage of affiliates, they'll take advantage of the internet, but that's not necessarily a sign of a sort of grand wisdom or control of the whole situation. I think that's partly a symptom of weakness.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yes.
Very quickly, looking again at the West as well, and when you look at how Al-Qaeda are telling people to, especially in America, where you can so easily get hold of very serious weaponry, they're telling them just go buy a gun and carry out a massacre, or get in your car and drive through, Christmas shoppers. Then it begs the question, why isn't it happening all the time? Because it could easily be, but it isn't, and that's because in the end, there's only a very, very small amount of people who are ever going to be willing to do that in the Western Muslim community. And, especially in America, you think, this would be so easy. Surely you just get a handgun and wipe out a couple of people. Why isn't it happening that much? Yes, there's a few plots are getting stopped, and I'm not saying it's not going to happen again. But actually, the last two big shootings in America were done by one psychopath and one neo-Nazi. So I think, again, looking from the Western perspective, it's not happening as nearly as much as one would think if it was such a huge problem.
So let me just briefly, before I hand this back to you, let me just sort of kind of construct the sort of balance sheet that we're seeing here in our analysis. What are the pros and cons? So the pessimists are arguing that there are new opportunities that have opened up as a result of the Arab Spring. Failed states always provide chances for Al-Qaeda to organize, to take advantage of. There is, according to some of the people in the audience here, increasing support for Al-Qaeda. On the other hand, the optimists would argue that actually there's not very much evidence for increased support for Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's brand is damaged because of some things that they have done in the past. Surely there are more legitimate channels now with the Arab Spring to express Islamist sympathies. Maybe we should be concerned about that too. And maybe from Israel's point of view, that represents an even bigger challenge than Al-Qaeda. But as for Al-Qaeda, it does actually represent something that challenges their method of conduct. And certainly, I would also highlight the point that Alex made here about capability. Capability matters. And this lone wolf strategy that Al-Qaeda is engaging in, to pick up on John's point, is not actually a sign of strength, but a sign of weakness. And it hasn't really worked in a very big way so far. So this is the sort of balance sheet, and we are sort of not entirely clear where it's going to go. But I want to open this up again to people in the audience here, maybe to respond to some of the comments from people. Yes, sir. Could you please introduce yourself? Okay.
When I hear they speak of the Arab Spring, but this is a period of loss and a period of renewal. And that's the difference in the perceived reality that I heard in the few minutes that I'm here about what the Arab Spring and what Al-Qaeda really is and where they are. Their context that they live in is very much different than our perception and our understanding of that reality. And I don't think it's being very properly. We're not really coming from their point of view and understanding the successes that were very clearly pointed out. They're way ahead, we just don't see it.
Sir, you had your hand up, no? Oh, okay. Frank. Shiraz and Alex can maybe quickly respond to that.
In terms of people traveling outwards, I think Alex touched upon it very well before when he was saying it's become increasingly difficult to physically go out to these places. Alex has been out, obviously, to Kenya. I've been to Pakistan not too long ago. It's very interesting to see the technology just at the airports now to track people and how they're monitoring people coming into the countries and so on. So I think at that most basic level, it's become a lot harder. The final point I would just make on this is that also if you look at Al-Qaeda's own material coming out through things like Inspire magazine, through other channels, they're saying to a lot of people, look, don't come to us because you're going to get tracked, you're going to get arrested, we're going to get in trouble. Here's a magazine, it tells you how to make a bomb, use your imagination and go and do something. So that the emphasis has very much become about sort of localizing it, empowering people at the local level to make their own decisions about targets and methods and so on. Alex.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much where I'm at, except it's also worth noting that we are focusing on the lone wolf threat to the West, but of course the last big plot was an AQAP centrally organized one. Turns out the guy was a double agent. So, again, shows you very, very weak operational capacity and capability. They organized another underwear bombing. Expert bomb maker made it, and they wanted to send him onto a plane. And so that is centrally organized, but the guy was a Saudi agent. And again, that is really bad for AQAP. The fact that that's possible, the fact that this is such a crucial guy. They didn't have the nous or the ability to find out that this guy was about to crack the whole thing wide open. So yeah, I mean, that's where I'm at. Really.
Yes, sir. Briefly.
Maybe we're looking for the dime under the map. In other words, as things change, the critical issue, that's like, they say, if I understood it, it's intelligence. Intelligence, 95% of being able to intercept, to prevent, or to preempt this intelligence. And it becomes, in my view, much more difficult to gain the kind of intelligence when Al-Qaeda uses an opportunity of an Arab Spring rising and lays down language is different, strategy is different, so the dynamics are also different. Now, what's happening now in the context of Boko Haram might be taken to that poverty, corruption, but I beg to disagree. Because I think even in the military training service, there are recently just a term that is working in group. It's called that Islam by political appointment because they have a mission, and the mission has been said by the Ottoman Project, extend Islam on the focus of caliphate on the sea, and that is the current axis of Nigeria. So gradually while this trend is going on, I remember about 10 years ago, in September 2001, the attack in Jos City was something that we least expected. And simultaneously, within a couple of days, that was when we had the 9/11 attack in New York. And after the first attack of Christian in Jos City, a couple of days later, the Central Market, which is one of the best in the whole of West Africa, it's a security that identified for tourists, was bombed down, and we were having all information to know that this was bombed down. Yet the Western world choose to neglect until the President Trump, Boko Haram, is responsible for the bombing of the United Nations and all the rest of that. And they say they're going to go right to the south for oil exploration. And yet there's no response. We're still waiting for Western activism and intellectuals. And I think the target will continue to be not only ordinary Nigerians. Like where I come from, my first senator was killed. A member of House Assembly was killed when they went for a burial. About 19 people killed. And what happened? The military officers in charge of the area with the chopper could not be reached on the radio or the telephone. The fact is that stop listening. And when presidents feel like in the police, there was a kind of Muslim who began into the secondary school, the primary school, to get recruited into the police and into the army, and they apply to the people. So when there's an attack, they know when it's going to happen. All the commander needs to do is turn a blind eye or direct the officers and men under him to other direction. And when it happens, it's off the power. So I think the dynamic at play is beyond like what you say. The way they move is highly sophisticated, and it's globalized. When Christian Solidarity, this is what I had conversation with that the last time I was here. When the Christian
I'll interrupt you when it gets boring.
worldwide, from Britain came to Nigeria, a few places there, and they make an observation. From Sudan to Nigeria, there is a limit. And some of us make this observation also. Not the Nigerian government believe them. And I have a copy of the report that they make. Now, there is also a link between Chad, Niger Republic, and I think Somalia to the friendly Nigeria to be. And yet again, the government will deny. And those in government, there is an alliance with those in government, the political class outside government, because the interest is to further Islam. Now, for instance, the Nigerian guy who was arrested was attempting to board the plane, the Delta plane, the masses. Some of us are privileged to know this father who was sympathy was a train man that was going on in the North Kaduna, the Camel State. There was sympathy, and we get a private information that we get to know. So it's not surprising that somebody who saw this well-educated schooling in the UK, this man is very well read. The phenomenon is that the target of counter-terrorism are also illiterate from the poor class, as John argued. Because they're very smart and very, very intelligent. And what they do, they go for people who they know have been there for the Islam, because it's not just ideological, but it's a war declared against the West, against Christians, and against the Muslims.
Okay, thank you. So that was an interesting footnote from one of the theaters that we've been talking about. I'll take a few more comments, and I'll start with Colonel Brown.
My name is Colonel Brown. I'm a military professor at Desert One College in the States. I like Ben had explained that there was a balance here. One thing that seems like it wasn't mentioned from the side of their reply is that some of my colleagues here said that you look at you talk about the accomplishments, but when you look at the lens of what you actually set out to accomplish, nearly nothing during these emergencies in terms of what may actually occur in these countries, how much it might turn towards Islamist tendencies or not, and whether or not Al-Qaeda has the wherewithal to formulate the leader, whether or not they're able to take advantage of some political transformations that occurred, or I think there's still a dangerous tendency, and I think that our historical ability to predict things has been extraordinarily efficient. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the nuclear storm or whether we're talking about historical or political outcomes. Any year the last century, and we're 10 years, and most everybody, analysts and historians agree, they got it completely wrong. Changes in energy markets, and changes in politics, and changes in economies, and certainly changes even in demographics are going to affect this discussion, and Al-Qaeda itself, or whether or not they're able to take advantage somehow and overcome that. I think that one thing you have to remember is in this kind of interactive game, you need a relatively small number of people to make a disproportionate outcome potentially, and that includes the fact of whether or not they are able ever to gain some form of extraordinary lethal immunity. So it's not out of the possibility. So as unsatisfying as it is, I think that a lot of things are very strategic.
Excellent analysis. Yes. Well, let's ask Don, because you've talked about some of these issues. You've talked about some of these groups transforming themselves into other kinds of groups, and also about the challenges of occupying territory.
I focus on South and Central Asia, so I'll limit my remarks to that region. I wish that I had the depth to talk about AQAP and some of those challenges, but unfortunately I don't. In terms of rebranding of AQ, I think that one of the interesting things, which I believe is a sort of understudied dimension of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, is the creation of what's described as sort of the, within Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, sort of a bureau for dawah and sort of missionary work, and it's unclear, and typically this is associated with Al-Qaeda's media arm, and particularly messages that are targeted in Urdu to Pakistani audiences. But really, what is the broader, and there's absolutely tension there, because if you have, Al-Qaeda's philosophy sort of is if you will, is a rejection of, in terms of their methods, of politics, as the solution, of, dawah as the solution. But I'm just wondering how Al-Qaeda being in a place like Pakistan for 10 years, what they have learned from other groups, and do they look at an entity like Lashkar-e-Taiba and say, hey, we have similar aims, we're different. But what's interesting about, and again, I don't really know, and I don't think anybody does, regarding the Al-Qaeda-Lashkar relationship, but to what extent does Al-Qaeda look at an entity like Lashkar-e-Taiba and say, hey, well, they have a different end game, that they're trying to reform society from within. And so, I can't really speak to the extent that Al-Qaeda is interested in those dynamics, but the fact that they've created, a department for dawah, it illustrates that maybe they're thinking about these issues or more open to them. It was interesting. It was, I guess, leaked to the press based upon some of the materials from Bin Laden's compound that Bin Laden was in steady communication with Al-Qaeda. So to me, that's an interesting point of tension, particularly in AFPAC. You also have the dynamic, you mentioned branding. One of the letters that the CTC released out of the 17 from Abbottabad was a letter believed to have been allegedly written by Bin Laden, where he talks about the need to rebrand Al-Qaeda. So I would just pose the question of, well, if Al-Qaeda's been so successful in terms of their image and branding, why are they considering the need to actually rebrand themselves? Because they realize that there's a problem in terms of the perceptions, how they're being viewed. And the names that they had suggested are really interesting in terms of actually moving in a direction that suggests that they are more open to dawah and some of these other issues. That's a tension that I think should be explored. I don't have a good answer to sort of to provide clarity with respect to that, but it's something, at least with respect to AFPAC, that would be worth looking into. Hopefully that helps to address your question.
Before I give the word to Shiraz, I recommend there was an article written a couple of years ago, which actually was published in the CTC Sentinel by one of our associate fellows, Ryan Evans, who wrote about how quite deliberately AQAP has been learning from the failures of AQI, and how in governing territory, holding territory, how the entire strategy is actually one big lesson from the failure of AQI, how they are intermarrying with the tribes and trying to establish a local base, how their whole military strategy, for example, avoids creating Yemeni civilian casualties because they know that that would annoy the people in the area. So there seems to be quite some deliberate learning going on when they govern territories. But Shiraz, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on from Don's point there. Something that he was saying sort of resonated with me in terms of, not so much in terms of how they're learning necessarily for control of territory, but how they're sort of seeking to win hearts and minds. Within the Pakistani context, of course, you've seen much more recently them engaging in the kind of social welfare activism that's traditionally been the reserve sort of Hamas and Hezbollah that we've seen them engaging in. So in Pakistan, after the earthquake, after the floods as well, there's been a lot of outreach there for the community to win hearts and minds of the local population, all of which, of course, helps them dissolve into the background in those areas. So I thought that was maybe something interesting to consider. They've never really done that kind of outreach before. They've traditionally, of course, attacked a lot of these populations physically and in words. And just sort of a spin-off from that, I don't know if you were here for the plenary where Peter was talking about the paper that we've produced, which is forthcoming, but there is a sort of kindred outreach from people like Ayman Zawahiri and from others within Al-Qaeda to the newly elected leaders, I suppose, of the Arab Spring, to try and say, well, we're all brothers, we should work together and put aside our differences, which of course is a huge step change in tone. Zawahiri wrote a book called The Bitter Harvest, which slammed the Muslim Brotherhood for being too weak and for being too pragmatic. And now, of course, that they are in power, he's saying, let's put this all in the past. And again, it's a sort of way, I suppose, to try and gain some sort of foothold there.
Alex, how does this play out with Al-Shabaab in Somalia? How are they perceiving some of the experiences of Al-Qaeda?
Well, like Nigel mentioned, even though they announced themselves to be part of the global jihad, and they had this recent announcement of the alliance with Al-Qaeda, it's not as simple as say that everyone there is on the same page. From what I understood, speaking to military as well as other people in Kenya on Shabab, the understanding in the West at the moment, the sort of received wisdom on the splits in Shabab is that one lot want to do are more interested in the local issues and creating a sort of Sharia state, and not interested in outside or any sort of global conflict, and that the other side are Al-Qaeda, and that there's this clash. And I don't think it's actually not that simple. I mean, that is an element to it, but actually there's things you got to remember, especially in Somalia and Kenya. It's the clan, and not only clan divisions, but sub-clan divisions. What we have seen in Somalia, what the leadership are good at doing is presenting a unified face to you very rarely hear a leader come out and complain about anything, but behind the scenes they're very unhappy. For example, Hassan Dahir Awais, one of the leaders who's thought to be sort of anti-global jihad, he's much more angry about the fact that his clan are the ones doing a lot of the dying, and are doing, for example, the second Ramadan offensive, which was an attempt to take back Mogadishu. It was almost exclusively his own clan who were killed, whereas Godon's Isaac, who's the other leader, Godon is one of the other main leaders, were barely there, and so he has not forgotten that. Also, Godane refused to take Western aid during the drought. Again, the areas that were affected by the drought were not Godon's clan. It was Awais' clan that was affected, that was dying and starving and had nothing to eat. And Awais wanted to get the money, wanted to get the Western aid in because he was concerned about his people. Godon refused it. These are the reasons why they have these problems, mainly. It's not, and we have this issue with Omar Hamami, the American, who got in trouble, who was arrested. Again, he was not arrested, I don't believe, because of his desire to have a global jihad. He was arrested because he came out and announced the problems that were going on. He released this video saying he was afraid for his life, that there were these divisions, he was arrested after that. And he has subsequently been released at the behest of Godon in an attempt to sort of not put off Westerners. And as discussing earlier, his status now is not really known. But and I think, our friend from Nigeria was mentioning this, how the ideology can transcend the clan issues. And again, I couldn't say too much about Boko Haram, but from my understanding, is there are a lot of tribal issues within there that we don't maybe hear about. But yes, that's really it.
Okay. More comments and questions from the audience? Yes.
Thanks for the question, and to bring in the question of, I think I can answer that with a question on the Arab Spring, and also the question on strategic failures and failures of analysis and imagination. In terms of the Arab Spring as a coiled spring, if you like, ready to sort of bounce back against the West, I think there's another way to look at it, which is that it's more of a Pandora's box of unintended and unexpected outcomes. And if you like, since 9/11, I think this addresses your question as well, through to the period now, we have sort of lived in this world where this sort of East versus West perception, a lot of talk about a war of ideas. Of course, that's Al-Qaeda fantasy land. Samuel Huntington is fine for Al-Qaeda in that respect. The reality of what's happened in the Arab Spring is an internalization of a lot of disputes that were boiling up and ready to happen for years. And this gentleman's comments on demographics, on internal regional sectarian divisions, all those have come to the fore, and it exploded actually. So this is something which Al-Qaeda and Shiraz has alluded to. This is trying to make itself relevant to in various portions of what's happening in the Middle East. Actually, internal disputes, sectarian issues, that's really the sort of what's happening in the Middle East more broadly. So another gentleman alluded to Iran, Al-Qaeda connections. Of course, this has been self-serving and useful in the last 10 years, where there's been a perception this is American power versus Middle Eastern interests. In fact, again, this internal power struggle, geopolitical struggle within the Middle East, means that those marriages of conveniences are collapsing. actually. So if you like, the war has come home to the Middle East in that respect. Western hubris and power has been blunted significantly. In terms of living with the consequences of the war on terror, very, very good question. I guess you'd have to ask those responsible for sort of initiating it in the first place, whether that's good or an acceptable outcome. Certainly ambitions for a revolutionary transformation in the Middle East severely blunted. But actually, if you take this zero-sum game and you go back to pure realpolitik and you go back to this Churchillian idea of a war in the periphery, well, in a Middle East which is internalizing its disputes, rather than the old Middle East, which gave birth to Al-Qaeda and gave birth to this spring towards the West, is probably, in purely selfish terms, better for America.
So you wanted to come back.
Yeah, in reference to whether Al-Qaeda is a company, and they had their 7-stage plan that was justified. They've gone through the first 4 steps. One, the jihad, the awakening, the standing up, the spreading into other countries, and the removal of Muslim regime. Okay? It doesn't matter whether they lose the regime. It's a known goal for them. Okay? So they have accomplished it. The only view, I think, is spectacular. If you look at the landscape in 2001 compared to today, do you always agree with the landscape? I come around and say that is a silly claim. If you look at the future, you see the past year, things are really changing off that. You look at Al-Qaeda, what's their enthusiasm? If you read about research or reviews, they are very excited about what's happening to the global center, which Al-Qaeda is being occupied. They are excited about the landscape of the terrorism community. So their enthusiasm in the internal communications and experience. So I think there's a phenomenon called anyway, to understand strategic thinking, you have to look long term. Where were we 10 years ago? Where are we today? And play a map, we say, okay, we say this is what their strategy was, and this is what they've accomplished. And we can see that it's essentially replicable.
Any more? Just 1 second before I give you the word for the third time. Yes, Zach has.
I work for a nonprofit. When you achieve your goals, you put yourself out of business. And in this case, when Al-Qaeda isn't in governance, they might have achieved their goals, but they're not in control of the situation. They're becoming more and more irrelevant. And this is kind of what's happening in Mali. They've invited Malian administration back in because they just can't keep up with terrorism. They do not provide critical services, and so they need the administrators to come back in, even though they are nominally in military control of the area.
Mm-hmm. Frank, you were also.
Just a brief comment on my first question. First, I would agree with the criticisms from my pleasure here. Fundamentally, Neumann is fundamentally against the terrorists. And of course, I would also agree that Al-Qaeda cannot be that activate because of its own roots in the past. However, I consider, say, that the changes not really begin from also the spread of Europe and America. And if you read what they're doing in the past weeks, a group of young 20 Muslims that were detained for Islamic State in the south of the center. We had included the running arrests of 11 Muslims, people from India, who were very justly attacked in the mission of Christians living near the border with Somalia. And these 2 cases were put into court. Somalia and probably also Al-Shabaab. So it seems there's still a lot of links between groups in Europe and between Islamic State people in the country.
Yuan, and then we'll come to you. But first, Yuan.
When I say about the misunderstanding, I have a question which is connected with natural resources and Al-Qaeda. That I'm facing a question on an article I read from Assaf magazine, Global Heading. In this article, he mentioned the bridging multipolarity and Al-Qaeda at war, and he said that
it's in the cyber field. It's not on the ground, but you can activate it immediately. And I think this requires the intelligence services, Al-Qaeda, is to sit on those social networks 24/7, all the time. And that becomes even more difficult because you don't know on which social network to sit. So this is a whole new ballgame of how Al-Qaeda uses technology for the, I would say, traditional things of recruitment, setting dormant cells. That really goes.
Okay. Let me quickly ask, first of all, Don, on the non-conventional question, because I'm sorry I'm always picking on you, Don, but with the tough questions. But you've on several occasions you referred to the Abbottabad papers, and you're probably more familiar with what Bin Laden was thinking about than most of us. So is there much stuff on non-conventional weapons in those papers? What was Bin Laden thinking about?
There really isn't much in terms of in the Abbottabad papers about non-conventional weapons. I will say, though, the comment about youth that was made regarding the Abbottabad papers, it is striking. I mean, it's striking in one sense, but not in another. Is that really Al-Qaeda is taking a long view, and that is reflected in the Abbottabad papers. That naturally Al-Qaeda views youth as their future and want to cultivate influence there. In terms of, so I don't really have a good answer regarding non-conventional terrorism in that batch of material, or more broadly in Harmony material that we've had access to. So I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer.
Alex, you wanted to. In 1 second.
Just on the both what the two gentlemen mentioned about the radicalization in the media. I mean, we use the term lone wolf. It's actually inaccurate. I mean, they're not alone. They are part of this online social network, and they help each other out. They talk to each other. They bolster each other's ideas. I mean, so again, I keep using the example of Roshanara Chowdhury, the British girl who tried to kill her local MP. But she is the ultimate sort of nightmare scenario for intelligence services. She had no connections to any terrorist organization. From what we know, other than being on YouTube and being on these websites, she was not in contact with anybody directly. She just one day decided, well, not one day, but over a process of a few months, decided that she's going to carry out this attack. And you can't stop that. You can't legislate for that. There's nothing you can do about that, really. But that also means that unless she somehow has some very technical expertise, in the case of Breivik, for example, he was able to build a very dangerous bomb, but he had a number of sort of things that were working in his advantage. He had a farm. He was able to order all the required materials for bombs that looked just like normal farming stuff. But that was, I think, a special case. Normally, it's not going to be, that dangerous. And on the issue of the fact that Westerners are still getting radicalized, you mentioned Germany, the young men going to Al-Shabaab and Sinai. We have got the problem of people still wanting to do this and getting radicalized. But really, after 9/11 and after 7/7, the main goal was to reduce the capability and remove the capability. That's almost been achieved, the capability of a sort of massive attack. The next step, but we still have a lot of people who want to do this, but we have removed capability. The next move that we need to make is remove the desire to do this. That's going to be a much longer process, but we've gotten on top of the capability stuff as far as. When the fact is, you mentioned these cases. The fact is, you know about these cases. That tells you everything. They didn't succeed. They tried, but the fact that we know about them means that nothing. They didn't do very well.
So you wanted to talk about non-conventional.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, in the Abbottabad letters, there was AQI had asked about conducting an attack using some kind of chemical, maybe it was just a chlorine attack or something like that. So they were asking for permission to use that from the seniors from AQSL. And if AQSL disappears and everything becomes regional, I'd say there is a risk of less control over such attacks. That there's a potential that a regional affiliate may not have the strategic thinking that
Yes.
Add to the unconventional weapon, especially in the first half in 2005, they had several plots to put pricing on dollars and other stuff like that. They
a guy named Abu Khabab al-Masri, which was the top, let's say, top guy in the organization who knew how to deal with this stuff. And when he died, he mounted the American bombs. So most of the biological planning to make attacks lost. That on, we rarely see any pushback.
Shiraz,
I just wanted to make a point on that. It's interesting that you mentioned about the asking for permission thing. I wasn't aware of that. But there is a small discussion in one of the editions of Inspire magazine where they talk about building a dirty bomb. And essentially they say, if you're out there in the West and you have the expertise and the access, just start doing it. Don't discuss it with anybody. Don't tell your friends. Don't try and put a team together. Just get on with it. And I thought that was an interesting, like you're saying, a sort of devolution of power and control, just saying, look, you should take matters into your own hands and spread this.
Assaf.
Yeah, just a quick point on Johan's question about the splintering of the movement and if that raises the chance. I mean, I think it raises the number of intentions, groups that have potentially the intentions to do it, but whether they have the capability to do it is a completely different question. I mean, and you just have to look at how difficult it was for Shinrikyo, right, a group that was completely dedicated to producing sarin nerve gas, and they had and it was perhaps the world's richest organization ever. And it took them years, and they had several trial runs, and they failed. I mean,
recruiting
they
top
succeeded.
scientists.
They recruited top scientists, and essentially, they didn't manage to kill so many people in their attacks. And so it's even if it may generate more intentions, but it's very, very difficult to disseminate these types of non-conventional attacks.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. I want to talk about the relevance of demography, which I believe the Muslims, I think not only in Africa but globally, knows the effect of number. But I want to give an opinion about the impression that is often had about the Muslims, whether it was in Africa or Arab countries. For instance, I came across an American here in Israel when I was there just some days ago in my African life. It was like, wow, you look like a Muslim, and a Muslim in the U.S., and you have intelligence of police going after you. And I told him I'm a Christian. Now, after much discussion, I realized he doesn't understand the setting of Nigeria or African dressing with regards to culture. And why I'm saying this so that academicians will have to understand what they've been working in Africa with regards to culture, dressing. For instance, I speak Hausa comfortably, which is the language mostly spoken by Muslims in the north, and Ghana and some other areas like Sudan and Niger. Now, I believe that in understanding the context of a Muslim, do not mistake an average Muslim who does not have Western education to be an illiterate. For instance, the culture of Islam, as I understand it at the limited level, gives a certain value of education, not necessarily Western. And that is why, like one of the speakers just said, take an average Muslim who cannot speak English, give him the tools to make a bomb, he can do it perfectly. Just like somebody who has been trained in the military. And that's why they can be able to effectively maximize whatever training they're given, whether in Somalia, whether in the Middle East, whether in Afghanistan or Pakistan. And that's why you have the recent trend now in suicide bombing in Nigeria. So please, I want us to understand that, and especially when I have discussion with Muslims who never went beyond secondary school in Nigeria and they have gone to Islamic schools, their understanding when you discuss with them in Hausa language is perhaps much more higher than a Christian graduate from a university. Now you can understand the line I'm trying to draw with. And now with regards to demography.
Briefly.
Okay, briefly, a governor in the northern state was like, I'm introducing Sharia because the people of my state who are majority Muslim have demanded Sharia as a rule. And the president couldn't say anything simply because democracy is about numbers. And I think I want to advise that Europe and US should be mindful of the fact that the growing population of Muslims, whether it's from the Middle East, whether it's from Africa, whether it's from Asia, it's deliberate and well calculated because they know when they have more and they do not care much about social standard of living like most of the Westerners do. So they could have more children, and just a matter of 10, 20 years, you have mayors, you have city councillors, you have governors, and representatives in parliament who are Muslim, and then they can be able to influence, because I saw that in Africa, and then they can be able to make purchases of landed property and then have investment, and by so doing influence decision making in Western countries.
Okay. Shiraz, would you like to?
It's so conspiratorial. It's ridiculous. If I'm honest and frank with you, it's an old argument. It's debased. The idea that there's some kind of demographic time bomb ticking within Europe, and this is part of a calculated wave of immigration attack, it barely merits any further discussion. I don't know what to say. It's not about numbers. It's not about demographics. It's about values. And there's no problem with Muslims in Europe per se, whether there's 10 Muslims, 10 million, or 10 billion for that matter. It's about injecting and inflecting the normative values of Europe, getting Muslims to embrace those, and building a cohesive society.
Okay. So let's have just a couple more responses, and then we finish up. David.
Very quick comment on the asymmetrical weapons issue. It is very true that all things we're talking about, whether chemical weapons or biological weapons, certainly nuclear weapons, are very, very difficult to obtain and very difficult to weaponize, particularly chemical and biological. Regardless of whether you're talking virus, bacteria, it doesn't matter. It's very difficult to make effective. That doesn't mean, however, that you have groups of people that are looking for innovative ways to kill large numbers of people. Whether someone comes up with a new idea of using an airliner or putting a hole in liquid natural gas or something in a tank or somewhere, it doesn't mean it's not correct just because it hasn't happened or because it's different. That means it's different.
Do we have any more people showing up? So for the very last time today.
That's intelligence thing. I think we focused a lot on Al-Qaeda. I'm going back to my virus narrative. You have to focus on the carrier. The virus dwells in a carrier, and sometimes there are different carriers. The one in Southeast Asia is not like the one in the Horn of Africa. The one in Europe is not. So I would say that the intelligence service has to ask themselves, where would they dwell? What would be the best place in this particular country or this particular that they could find a supportive environment? And then you focus on them, because I think this is one of the things that surprises us and that we're not able to come up with a solution is the adaptability of this virus to different environments and to different carriers. And he may stay with that carrier dormant for a long time until he bursts out. So I would suggest to intelligence look at the carrier too.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone on the panel who wants to say anything in conclusion, perhaps, or pick up on some of the elements? John.
Just briefly on this question of demography, education. Of course they matter. Of course it helps us understand regions or areas that are from which the threat emerges. But in terms of its relationship with the potency of threat, I think we can overestimate that. And I'll give you a sort of sobering, perhaps slightly boring example. In terms of the threat posed by Al-Qaeda inspired or Al-Qaeda cells in the UK, the IRA far outstripped that in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And even the rump left of IRA members and groups like the Real IRA still pose a far greater threat in terms of bomb-making capacity and actually in terms of people killed directly by terrorism, even in the last few years. So we can think and get scared about these big, broad themes, but the potency of threat relates to opportunity, local circumstances, and expertise. Those operations do matter, and we should know more about the big trends, but we don't always need to conflate the two.
So let me just say a few words at the very end before you get up, which is that I thought this was a very, very interesting discussion, and I'll tell you why. Because we have managed to touch on all the relevant issues. We've constructed this balance sheet that David highlighted, and because it's so important, because Al-Qaeda, I truly do believe, is at a crossroads. And whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, I think everyone agrees that Al-Qaeda is changing. And it is important, both if you are from an academic background and if you're from a policy background, to think about the different variables that will affect the trajectory of Al-Qaeda and global jihadism in the future. And I think this discussion has brought out a lot of the variables that will likely play a role. I said at the workshop yesterday, and I'll repeat it today, I agree with Boaz Ganora, who said on the first day or the second day of the conference that these conferences and workshops rarely ever produce a consensus, and they are not designed to produce a consensus. But the point of these workshops and conferences is to have a stimulating conversation. And if you go away with one new idea, one new piece of food for thought that will perhaps address some of the things that you have been thinking about, then we've already made a big gain. So thank you for all your contributions, and I look forward to seeing you for the rest of the day. And thank you to the panelists, too. Thank you.